Malaysia has seemingly everything: rich lands with enormous natural resources, a diverse population and beautiful landscapes, which make it an attractive tourist destination. Maybe even you yourself have traveled to Malaysia or considered it. Malaysia is also located at a highly strategic location that acts as a gateway to Southeast Asia, which is incredibly important for both global trade and military. Yet, despite all of that, their tiny neighbor Singapore is 6 times richer in terms of GDP per capita. Malaysia's government outlined large targets back in 1991 for the country. These targets were to be achieved by the year 2020. However, we now know that they failed to achieve those targets. What did Malaysia get right, and what went so wrong? To understand Malaysia and its economy better, some of the country's history has to be revisited. On the 16th September 1963, the Federation of Malaysia was formed following the merger of the Federation of Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak, and North Borneo. However, just 2 years later, in August 1965, Singapore was expelled from the Federation and became its own independent country. Malaysia is separated by the South China Sea into 2 regions, Peninsular Malaysia and Borneo's East Malaysia. As one of 3 countries that control the Strait of Malacca, international trade has always played a very significant role in Malaysia's economy. A country's geography is always an important factor when looking at a country's economy, due to the trade which is enabled between different countries. Geography can also play a factor for certain efficiencies or disadvantages. A highly mountainous area, for example, is normally a disadvantage for having efficient trade routes or agriculture. Depending on the geography, more or less natural resources can also be present. In the 1970s, Malaysia began to imitate the 4 Asian tiger economies, which are Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea and Taiwan. They committed to a transition from a mining and agriculture-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy. At one time, Malaysia was the largest producer of tin, rubber and palm oil in the world. Back in 1979, Malaysia was producing almost 63,000 tons of tin, accounting for 31% of the output of the entire world. Since the early 1970s, the government has brought forward a social and economic restructuring strategy known as the New Economic Policy, or shortly called NEP, which was later known as the New Development Policy, or NDP. This strategy had the goal of striking a balance between economic growth and wealth redistribution. Malaysia's economy has long been dominated by Chinese and South Asian minorities. The new development policy has aimed to provide other ethnicities, such as the Malays and other indigenous groups, with greater economic opportunities, while also developing their management and entrepreneurial skills. Official economic policy has also encouraged the private sector to play a larger role in the restructuring process. Many public sector activities, including the National Railway, airline, automobile manufacturers, telecommunications and electricity companies have been privatized as part of this policy. Privatization is the transfer of government services or assets to the private sector. The goal is to increase efficiency, which can potentially be achieved by having more competition and a larger appetite for profit by private owners. Of course, privatization can also have negative effects, such as potentially leading to labor or overall resource exploitation and corruption, as that has happened following privatization in some other countries. Since the 1980s, Malaysia's growth has been led by the industrial sector. High levels of investment played a significant role in this. Heavy industries flourished as a result of Japanese investment, and Malaysian exports quickly became the country's primary growth engine. Manufacturing still plays a large influence in the country's economy today, accounting for almost a quarter of its GDP. In the 1980s and 1990s, Malaysia consistently achieved more than 7% GDP growth while maintaining a low inflation rate. In 1991, former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir bin Mohamad, outlined his ideal, Vision 2020, in which Malaysia would become a self-sufficient industrialized nation by 2020. A government minister said Malaysia could attain developed country status in 2018 if the country's growth remains constant or increases. We will clear up in the end why Vision 2020 ended up being mostly a failure. Malaysia today is the world's largest Islamic banking and financial center, but back in 1997, the Asian financial crisis hit the continent and Malaysia was not spared. Between 1995 and 1997, the Malaysian ringgit, the currency of Malaysia, was trading as a free float currency at around 250 ringgit to the US dollar, meaning the price of the currency was completely controlled by supply and demand. But following the onset of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the Malaysian ringgit witnessed major dips by the end of 1997 as a result of capital flight and speculation by traders. Capital flight occurs when assets or money rapidly flows out of a country as a result of an economic event or as a result of a political event such as regime change or economic globalization. Then, in September 1998, as part of a series of capital controls, the currency was pegged at 3.8 Malaysian ringgit to the dollar after the value of the currency dropped heavily. Furthermore, to dampen the flow of money out of the country, the Malaysian ringgit was designated as non-tradable outside of Malaysia in 1998. In recent years, the Bank Negara Malaysia, the central bank of Malaysia, has begun to relax certain rules to the capital controls, although the currency itself is still not traded internationally yet. According to the bank governor, the ringgit will be internationalized when it's ready. Malaysia experienced an economic boom and underwent rapid development during the late 20th century and has been growing fast up until 2014, when Malaysia reached a GDP of $338 billion with a GDP per capita of about $11,000. As of today, Malaysia is considered a newly industrialized country with a GDP per capita of $11,100. In 2019, the average income in Malaysia was 7,900 Malaysian ringgit, while Malaysia's median income was recorded at 5,870 ringgit. Surprisingly though, during the past 10 years, their GDP per capita hasn't really improved much, as in 2011 the GDP per capita was about $10,200 compared to about $11,000 today. At the same time, Malaysia's overall GDP is still increasing at around 4 to 6% during the past years, excluding the years 2020 and 2021, which were not normal obviously. The population of Malaysia currently sits at around 33.5 million inhabitants, and its population growth is at 1.1% each year. However, that growth is declining. Malaysia's largest trading partner is China. Malaysia has been among China's top trading partners within the ASEAN region for many years now. Malaysia was even China's top trading partner within the region. However, Vietnam overtook Malaysia in the spot of being China's largest trading partner within the region. The two-way trade volume between China and Malaysia in 2022 reached $203 billion, making Malaysia China's sixth largest trading partner in Asia. So what does Malaysia's economy consist of today? The first economic sector, agriculture, is only a minor sector of the Malaysian economy, accounting for just 6.3% of Malaysia's GDP in 2022, while employing 11.1% of Malaysia's labor force. This is in contrast with the 1960s, when agriculture accounted for 37% of Malaysia's GDP and employed 2/3 of the entire labor force. The crops grown by the agricultural sector has also significantly shifted from food crops like rice and coconut to industrial crops like palm oil and rubber, which in 2005 contributed to 83.7% of total agricultural land use, compared to 68.5% in 1960. Malaysia has a very strong industrial sector. The country is one of the world's largest exporters of semiconductor devices, electrical devices, and IT and communication products. Malaysia's industrial sector accounts for 33.9%, over a third of the country's GDP in 2022, and employs roughly 36% of the labor force. The industrial sector is mostly contributed by the electronics industry, the automotive industry, and the construction industry. Malaysia has even its own car manufacturer called Proton. Proton has produced a mix of locally engineered and batch-engineered vehicles since 1985. Proton cars are currently sold in at least 15 countries, the majority of which are in Asia. Its largest export market was the United Kingdom, where its cars were sold until 2016. Proton has also entered a global strategic partnership with Geely in 2017. Geely was a topic in our video about the Chinese car market. Proton has just recently achieved its highest sale volume in the past 9 years, marking an impressive growth trend again after having had declining sales until 2018. Malaysia is also fairly strong in the third sector, the services sector. The services sector is the main contributor to Malaysia's economy and accounted for 58.6% of the entire economy in 2022. Its capital, Kuala Lumpur, has a thriving financial sector and is ranked 22nd in the Global Financial Centers Index. Malaysia is currently home to 27 commercial banks, 16 Islamic banks and 15 investment banks. The Malaysian government intends to turn the country's capital, Kuala Lumpur, into a major financial center in order to raise its profile and attract more international trade and investment through the construction of the Tun Razak exchange. The government believes that the project will enable Malaysia to compete with regional financial superpowers such as Singapore and Hong Kong by capitalizing on the country's established strength in the rapidly expanding Islamic financial marketplace. Tourism is another huge topic in Malaysia, with over 26 million arrivals to the country, generating 86 billion ringgit in tourism receipts in 2019. The tourism receipts show the country's earnings from tourism. The country has shown a significant growth in tourism receipts up until 2019 and will hopefully continue to pick back up, as they fell off a cliff in 2020 and 2021. In 2019, Malaysia was the fourth most visited country in the Asia-Pacific region after China, Thailand and Japan. But this is not the end of Malaysia's industry. The country has a vibrant oil and gas industry. The national oil company Petronas generates revenues of over 83 billion US dollars a year, with a net income of over 22 billion US dollars and total assets of over 158 billion US dollars. Petronas provides a substantial source of income for the Malaysian government, accounting for more than 15% of the government's revenue from 2015 to 2020. The world-famous Petronas Towers are also named after the massive company which is mostly occupying one of the two towers and has its headquarters there. So what happened to the Vision 2020 they set out back in 1991? In 2020, Mahathir Mohamad, the Prime Minister of Malaysia back then, officially announced the failure of the vision to achieve the status of a developed nation. Although the Vision 2020 did not fully achieve its objectives, Mahathir argued that other aspects of the vision had been achieved, such as for example Malaysia having become more prosperous and with better infrastructure. Which is for sure true that Malaysia has come a far way. But what went wrong? How come Malaysia did not achieve the status of a developed nation by 2020? And why is poverty still a way of life for many Malaysians today? While the inclusion of Malaysian billionaires on the international rich lists may tell one story, the narrative in Malaysia for about 2 decades now has been one of economic inequality. Income inequality in Malaysia remains high relative to other East Asian countries, but it is gradually declining, which is a good sign. While income growth for the bottom 40% has outpaced the top 60 over much of the last decade, the absolute gap across income groups has still increased, contributing to the widespread perceptions of the poor being left behind. There also exists a large inequality between the different ethnic groups of Malaysia. According to an article, The core issue of Malaysia's stagnation remains the country's treatment of race. The former Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew once famously said that Malaysian politics will always be based on race. Another reason is that the economy has slowed down industrialization after the Asian financial crisis. The plan had been at a steady pace towards the holistic development of the Malaysian nation, but the events in 97 and 98, an economist believes, threw everything off course. The pace of industrialization slowed down a lot after that. Yes, industries continued to grow, but it was nothing compared to the decade leading up to the financial crisis, he added. On top of that, so many national policies, including the NEP, have failed because of poor implementation. The NEP objective was to help raise the socio-economic status of the Malays. But that didn't happen. The policy got corrupted and abused. A further issue the country has is that there exists a large shadow economy, which is valued to be about a quarter of its GDP, or over $80 billion. The shadow economy, or informal economy, is the part that is neither taxed nor monitored in any form of government. Hand in hand with the shadow economy goes corruption. Corruption is a prominent topic in the country. According to a 2013 public survey in Malaysia by Transparency International, a majority of the surveyed households perceived Malaysian political parties to be highly corrupt. Malaysia has dropped points again in Transparency International's Annual Perception Index in 2022. In the group's latest report, Malaysia had a CPI score of 47 for 2022. The higher the score, the fewer corruption exists in the country, according to the ranking. The nation has dropped 6 points in the annual CPI over the past 3 years, from 53 points to 47. With the latest drop in the score, Malaysia now ranks behind Saudi Arabia, Namibia and Mauritius. Singapore is the only Southeast Asian country to make it to the top 10 and was ranked 5th in the world with a score of 83. Just to name one of the corruption scandals of Malaysia, on the 28th of July 2020, former Prime Minister Najib Razak was convicted on 7 counts of abuse of power, money laundering and criminal breach of trust by a Malaysian High Court. He was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment and fined 210 million Malaysian ringgit. A bit of a lesser talked about problem in Malaysia is its brain drain, an issue Singapore plays a big role in. Salaries in Singapore are significantly higher, leading to Malaysians of all social standings leaving the country for Singapore. This is especially true for well-educated young people. Those young people could have a significant impact in their own country of Malaysia, but decide to leave their home country. The starting pay for some young graduates can be as low as just 1,000 Malaysian ringgit, or just over $200. The average salary of fresh graduates has even decreased from 2010 to 2018. One of the reasons behind that is that the Malaysian economy is not creating enough sufficient high-skilled jobs to absorb the number of graduates entering the workforce. Despite having a relatively small unemployment number, Malaysia's problem of underemployment is present, further contributing to brain drain. This means that even when a person might be employed, they could be underemployed, often in a job in which they did not complete their education in. An often mentioned example is an engineer who couldn't find employment after university in their field, so they chose to do food delivery instead. This would not count towards the unemployment number, as that person has a job. Due to these issues, many Malaysians would rather leave their country for a brighter future abroad, where they are better compensated for their work. But what does the future hold for Malaysia? A pretty bright one, according to a HSBC report in 2012. According to that report, Malaysia will become the world's 21st largest economy by 2050, with a GDP of $1.2 trillion and a GDP per capita of $29,000. Currently, Malaysia is ranked number 36 in terms of GDP in the world. The report also says the electronic equipment, petroleum, and liquefied natural gas producers will see a substantial increase in income per capita. Malaysian life expectancy, relatively high levels of schooling, and above average fertility rate will help in its rapid expansion. And according to the report, Malaysia has all the right ingredients to become a developed nation. According to another source, the World Bank has noted the following about Malaysia's future. To fully realize its human potential and fulfill the country's aspiration of achieving the high income and developed country status, Malaysia will need to advance further in education, health and nutrition, and social protection outcomes. Key priority areas include enhancing the quality of schooling to improve learning outcomes, rethinking nutritional interventions to reduce childhood stunting, and providing adequate social welfare protection for household investment in human capital formation. It is hard to be negative about Malaysia's future ahead, as we are sure many great people will continue to emerge from this prosperous nation. Are you curious about other economies in Asia? Here is a video about Indonesia's economy and its dark side, which is rather unknown to most, along with our other newest video on the channel.